Joining me on stage today, we have Punongbayan, who is the Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice of the Asian Law Caucus, and Daniel Lee, the Executive Director of the Levi Strauss Foundation. Welcome.
Are we having fun yet? All right. Well, first of all, welcome to those of you who are visiting from outside the Bay Area. This area gets a lot of headlines for being a cradle of innovation in technology and entrepreneurship, but it's also a cradle of innovation in the area of justice, as many movements have stemmed out of this and are even today. Speaking of pioneers, I come from Levi Strauss & Company and the Levi Strauss Foundation, and we're inspired by a 163-year-old legacy that there was another gold rush before the one that's happening right now. Someone named Levi Strauss, who solved the problem as miners in the foothills of California were seeing their pants ripping, co-patented the riveted overall, which arguably is the first sustainable product. And everything we do 163 years later is in the spirit of innovation that he drove. And we're driven by four values: originality, empathy, integrity, and courage. And these are values that drive not only how we show up in the marketplace, but also community. And these have guided us to invest in an area that is really iconic in the Bay Area, which is the social justice sector. And if there's one sort of secret ulterior motive I have for this session, it's to disabuse anyone in this audience of the notion that entrepreneurship and technology have a lock on innovation. There's a lot to be said, actually, for the marriage of justice and innovation, and that's why I'm thrilled to be interviewing here Chris Punongbayan. And a bit of background. Chris is part of an initiative called Pioneers in Justice, which is our signature hometown initiative. I'm not going to give you a big brochure about this. You can Google it, and there's a book that tells you a lot more. We're working with 5 leaders of bedrock civil rights organizations in San Francisco who took the reins about 5 years ago, and Chris is one of those. When they took the reins of these organizations, which averaged 30 or 40 years, there was a moment of adapt or perish. And these leaders, in terms of equipping them for a rapidly shifting frontier, recognized they needed new tools of the day, new strategies. So it's been a 5-year journey working in 3 areas of change management. First, engagement with the new tools of the day, like social media. Second, new forms of collaboration and networking, as I like to put it, bringing some kink into collaboration and making the idea of unlikely allies the norm. And third, bringing voices of folks like Chris to the forefront as the voice of what we call social justice 2.0. Okay, that's enough background. Wham bam. And now I want to get to Chris, who is a remarkable leader. He is the executive director of the Asian Law Caucus, which is part of a national affiliation called Asian Americans Advancing Justice. Not only dashingly good looking, but a civil rights lawyer. And I want to ask the first question. Tell us briefly, what inspired you to go into civil rights law, of all the things you could have done? And tell us about that moment when you inherited the reins, as it were, of the Asian Law Caucus.
Thank you, Daniel, and thanks to everyone here who's organized this tremendous summit. This is the first time that I've been here, but I hope it's the beginning of a greater partnership between the justice community and the innovation sector. I became a civil rights lawyer many years ago because where I grew up in rural Massachusetts, I didn't really understand Asian American communities or justice issues because I grew up in ethnic isolation. I was really the only Asian American, the only person of color for miles to see. I know how to milk a cow, but I didn't really know about civil rights. But when I went to undergrad, I learned about Asian American history. I learned about racial justice history, and it motivated me to become more active in the community. I experimented with thinking about social work, about elected office, or anything like that, but when I came down to what I really wanted to do and how I really felt I could make a difference, it was addressing issues of inequality and how the law can be used to do that. So when I became executive director about a year ago, I was actually the first executive director of my organization who was actually younger than the organization. My organization was founded in 1972, and if you can imagine, on the heels of the civil rights movement, which Asian Americans were a part of, many justice organizations, nonprofit organizations that we have today, came on the heels of that. And so when I took the mantle, I wanted to make sure that the legacy of the institution as being the first Asian American civil rights legal organization in the country was respected. But we were, basically in the heart of Silicon Valley, the cradle of innovation, and I didn't really see that translating into the work that we were doing. So to the point that you had made, Daniel, about adapt or perish, we had solid victories in a long history of winning laws and policies that make our country more fair, but in some ways, it was only living for those specific clients or the very isolated communities. What we wanted to do was modernize. And how are we going to use the online space to be able to tell our story, but also to be able to affect change in its own right as a complement to the law and policy work that we were doing?
So you saw an opportunity to really gather this population of Asian Americans who are online, who are millennials. How do you see them as a linchpin for social justice 2.0?
Well, the studies have shown, from the Pew Center to Nielsen, that Asian Americans are the most digitally connected racial group of any group in the United States. Asian Americans have the highest rate of broadband usage access at home, are the highest users of laptops, smartphones, and even tablets. So we know Asian Americans are online, but I did see a space that was unoccupied in the digital sphere for addressing issues of inequality as they are meted out in the immigration system, in the civil rights context, in the criminal justice system. And so we wanted to try and launch an effort, which we just did in this past year, to harness the Asian Americans who were connected and online and advance our issues through online platforms.
Right. So two of the issues that are really, I think, challenging us as issues of the day in civil rights are criminal justice and immigration. Now, there's this myth that Asian Americans are this model minority, okay? Tell us how you see, first of all, that myth, as well as how you see Asian Americans engaging with these issues today.
So just a little bit of context. The United States has 5% of the world's population, but has 20% of the world's incarcerated population. In the immigration context, there are 11 million undocumented immigrants who are aspiring Americans. But when you think of this community, many people think of the Latino community and don't think about Asian Americans. But in fact, Asian Americans have skin in the game on both of these issues. There are 1.3 million undocumented Asian immigrants in the United States who have just as much to gain or lose, according to what happens on local, state, and federal immigration policy. But in the criminal justice reform context, many people don't think of Asian Americans, but the movement that is capturing the imagination of our country, as the Black Lives Matter movement has shown us, that this is something that Asian Americans are critically invested in, because how our democracy, how our multiracial democracy should be measured is according to how we treat the most vulnerable, the least powerful. And Asian Americans have a stake in that game. The reason why I say that is because this year is the anniversary of the Immigration and Nationality Act. This was the law that changed immigration to the United States. It's what allowed my parents to come to the United States. It's what allowed many immigrants from all over the country, all over the world, but particularly Asia, to immigrate to the United States. But part of the reason why that law passed 50 years ago, you may remember, it was at the same time that the Voting Rights Act passed, that the Civil Rights Act passed, laws that are fundamental to fairness today, which in the movements that made those laws possible were led by African Americans. So Asian Americans benefited from those laws. Asian Americans have skin in the game to make sure that we are standing alongside the Black Lives Matter movement to make sure that our democracy is as fair and equitable as possible.
So it's an ambitious leap, if you will, to take an organization that's around 40 years old, that's known for providing legal services, in person, and capturing and engaging this population of millennials online. Has it been smooth sailing? Have there been missteps, abysmal failures along the way? Enlighten us.
The specific initiative that we engaged in using online platforms and new technology was to activate online Asian American communities. Like I mentioned, we observed a vacuum. And so what we wanted to be able to do was create a vessel, if you will, or a way for Asian Americans and anyone else who believed in our issues to be able to express their point of view through our organization. This is not a legal strategy. This is not a policy strategy. In fact, when you're thinking about lawyers, you don't really think about innovation. But what we were trying to do was change the way we thought about influencing law and policy. So what we did was we launched campaigns to address what we saw as the unfair deportations of Asian immigrants. I want to tell the story of one individual, Daniel Mayer. You can go online and Google him. He was an individual who came to the United States when he was 3 from Macau, and he was a legal immigrant. He made some mistakes when he was a young person, and he paid for those mistakes. He was incarcerated for 5 years for robbery. But why we wanted to lift up his story, because he, many years later, had turned around his life. He's now in charge of the entire curbside recycling program for the city of Berkeley and has completely paid his dues and turned his life around, was because we saw an opportunity to mobilize an online community to stop his deportation, because his deportation was unfair and a result of our broken immigration system. So what we did was we launched an online campaign specifically targeting young people who find out about opportunities to express their activism through online channels. Credo, you may have heard of, Daily Kos, you may have heard of, Move On, but we were an Asian American voice advocating on a specific Asian American issue. And why it was important for us was because it was our own client. It was someone who's from our local community and was making a big difference. The punchline is that we were able to stop his deportation. We got thousands of people to sign the petition to stop his deportation, and it really revealed the power that the Asian American community can harness and express if given the opportunity through online engagement.
Any other missteps you want to share?
Oh, yes. So that was a success. Where we did experience a misstep was on a core issue of civil rights for the community, but it was on an issue that we weren't able to find a face of the story. So Daniel Mayer had a compelling story about his own human dignity. But on this issue of educational equity, specifically on the issue of affirmative action, we couldn't find a face, but we felt like it was a strong policy issue that we needed to assert an online presence on, and it got 100 people to sign it, and I bet they were all folks who are kind of the old guard, who didn't really understand what's at stake, because we didn't do the work to make sure that the human face was expressed through the work.
Well, we have we have about 1 minute left, and I think as a takeaway, I hope folks can see that any innovation that leaves justice behind and that doesn't color in the faces of people, whatever system that we might be working in, especially those who are most vulnerable, we can do better, and it really leaves an opportunity. I wanted to invite you just to leave us with a closing thought, something, maybe a word of hope or an opportunity in this area.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us in the nonprofit sector, in the justice sector, we are experimenting with innovation just as much as all of you in the business sector. And we don't have the answers. And I think what we've learned today is that there's many opportunities to continue to grow, but learn alongside each other, that the business sector and the justice sector can come up with new innovations by working more closely together. And I would just invite all of us to think about those partnerships that we can make in the nonprofit community that will bring about the social justice, community, and democracy that we want to see.
And perfectly with the countdown timer. Let's give Chris a huge hand. Thank you so much for showing us what pioneering leadership is about.